Do you like talking about weird stuff? Well, boy, have I got a video for you. But seriously, this is definitely going to be one of the more interesting videos I'm making. Recently, a YouTuber I do like, though I don't fully agree with anything he says, Whatifalthist made a video called "Did the CIA Discover the Spirit World?" And it's about Project Gateway and this attempt by the CIA to go into the spirit world and to study spirits and stuff. Very interesting video. Highly recommend you watch the whole thing. I'm starting about a third of the way through, and I'm just going to give my 2 cents, I guess you could say, on some of the interesting stuff I thought he talked about in this video and give my opinion on this stuff. I thought it would be particularly interesting because somebody of my religious tradition is few and far between. I'm a Christian universalist, very small religious tradition, and often in this conversation you have Christians on one end and then like spiritualists on another. And I thought I'm an interesting another group. I thought it'd be very interesting to include us into the conversation. But also overall, I just thought this would be a very interesting video to talk about. So this is definitely going to be a weird one, guys. Buckle up. And one other thing, I am a self-educated teenager, so you're listening to me at your own risk. I will get things wrong, and I am open to constructive criticism down in the comments. Just be respectful.
Robert Monroe. The guy who started and led Project Gateway was Robert Monroe. The biggest source for this video is the trilogy he wrote about how he did.
Now, I would like to point out that Robert Monroe is not alone. There have been many spiritualists throughout the centuries. In the 18th century, there was Emanuel Swedenborg, who started the Swedenborgian movement. He's been incredibly influential. He had followers like Helen Keller, actually, and Johnny Appleseed. It was actually going around proselytizing. That's what Johnny Appleseed was doing. So that was very interesting to learn. There were people like Edward Casey, a spiritualist in the 19th century, and there have been many different spiritualists throughout the centuries who have played around with this kind of thing. And of course, I am against it. I'm going to get more into why I think well, I'll tell you why I'm against it. But he found out through all this stuff by encouraging astral projection, which is for various methods, getting out of your body, getting your soul out of your body and going around the spirit world and talking to all these different spirits. And I'm vehemently against this. For a variety of different reasons. Of course, one, it's against my own religious tradition. We don't practice that in our own tradition. So, of course, I'm going to stay true to my tradition. But more importantly, this is a very dangerous thing to do. For one, we're just dumb. Angels, demons, and stuff, they are much smarter than us on this kind of stuff. They've been around much longer, and they can easily deceive us, and they often do. Spirits are going around preying on people. And also, you're opening up your body to potential possession because you're leaving your body vacant. You're opening it up to all sorts of weird things happening to you. So don't astral project. It's a very dangerous practice, especially if you're new to this kind of stuff. And I'm still learning myself. I would like to point that out. I'm not the grand master wizard or something, but I don't think it's a wise thing to do.
Did it, of which I've read the whole thing. It's hard for me to summarize everything he talks about, since it's like 1,000 pages. So if you're interested, I'd recommend reading it. Robert Monroe was a businessman from Ohio who moved to Virginia. In the 1950s, he started having strange experiences in which he started floating outside of his body, or at least his mind was. He went to multiple doctors and psychologists who basically had no idea on how to deal with this, or to help him. He kept on having these problems, so he decided to go on a journey of self-discovery to see what was going on. Monroe went through this bizarre journey of discovering the spirit world. He would go on trips through the spirit world, speaking to different intelligent species and beings, which would give him information on how the spirit world worked. He started out by doing this himself, and over decades, built the Monroe Institute, which was being funded by the CIA secretly for decades. Everything in this video, which I'm talking about with Project Gateway, is Monroe's baby. The Monroe Institute still exists today, so you can go to visit them in Virginia or download their sound frequencies for Project Gateway off the internet. However, please watch until the end of this video before you decide to do so. Monroe says he never studied world religions, and all the things he talked
about. Now, personally, I think that having a religious tradition is incredibly important when dealing with mystical things. And let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that all religions are equally inspired by God or the Great Spirit or whatever you want to call it. Well, every religion is kind of its own map of the spirit world. Buddhism is going to tell you one way of how the spirit world works than Christianity. And of course, Christianity is going to tell you a different way of how the spirit world works than Shintoism. and let's just assume they're all equally inspired by God. Well, it's very dangerous to go without a map, and even more dangerous. And I think this is one of the most abhorrent practices of the modern age is this buffetism, mixing all these different things together. The reason why first going without a map is very dangerous is you're one person, and it isn't so much his fault because he was already going out of his body, but it's very dangerous to not have a spirit tradition because essentially what you're doing is rejecting thousands of years of experimentation. These mystics of all these different traditions and prophets have experienced God throughout the centuries, and they've written down things and they've taught others in different methods, and they've made a map of how the spirit world works in their view. And it's very important to stick with a tradition because they were built up over the course of thousands of years. So essentially what you're doing if you don't have a map is you're going to a place you've never been before without a map. It's very dangerous to do that kind of thing, especially when it's the spirit world, where you're playing with your very soul. But also, it's incredibly dangerous, and I just think it's abhorrent to mix different maps, even though assuming that all the different religions are equally inspired by God. It's essentially what you're doing is you're taking something that was created by God, and you, a mere mortal, are mixing it into all sorts of different things. And this is something I really hate about contemporary religion. A lot of people are essentially practicing buffetism, where they really don't know that much about religions, and they're just mixing together different opinions. They'll take a little bit of Buddhism, or really a watered down Buddhism, that white lady Buddhism you have here in the West often. Watered down Buddhism, mix it with some Hinduism, mix it with some Christianity, a little bit of Shinto or something, some New Age stuff, a little bit of your own experiences and insights, some of your own politics and stuff. And boom, you've got a new religion. It's essentially the buffet religion. And this is very dangerous because you're essentially taking what God has built and you're making it in your own image, assuming that they're all equally inspired. And I'll get to my own opinion in just a minute.
Talks about are unique to himself and his journey. I genuinely do believe that, and having read 1,000 pages of Monroe, and as a person who has studied world religions, he doesn't draw logical conclusions in his writing that would be obvious to a person who had studied religion. The things Monroe saw are almost identical to Indian religions such as Hinduism and Buddhism. Reading Monroe is strange in that he'll make very 20th century acronyms for what are concepts that I see as being ancient Hindu things from 2,000 years ago. Monroe saw a spirit world in which different kinds of souls were constantly reincarnating into human bodies. The earth is a brutal place of Darwinistic struggle, which chews up souls, but who are addicted to the struggle and excitement that is human life. Once a soul gets tired of this endless wheel of life and reincarnation, they can graduate to the next level of development, which is a higher, holier place. A point Monroe makes is that there is a geography to the spirit world. He imagines himself driving down a highway, and there are different off-ramps which lead to different spiritual countries. One is the Abrahamic spirit world.
Okay, this is a really good argument, and it really challenged my faith. Long before this video ever existed, the argument I heard was a bit different. Instead of like every place in the spirit world to kind of like its own continent, the argument I heard, I believe, is a bit more sophisticated, and that is essentially you're going to see what you want to see. That everybody is going to see what they want to see. So if you're seeking Jesus, you're going to go see Jesus. If you're seeking Buddha, you're going to see Buddha. If you're seeking Islamic things, you're going to see Islam. God or the Great Spirit or and all these different mystical ideas. Essentially, you're going to manifest what you want to see. And I thought, man, that's a really good argument. Why am I a Christian then? And I did a lot of thinking about it and a lot of praying and study. And what I realized is that the big thing that sets Jesus apart from everybody else is that he claimed to be God. Nobody else of the major traditions claimed to be God. Now, it is true that the Hindus have Krishna, but Krishna came 1,000 years later, around the year 1100, and that's only due to Christian influence in India. India has had Christians in it since the time of Thomas the Apostle. But back to Jesus. And by the way, you could prove other religions with different miracles. The reincarnation thing, there are reincarnation stories. I will not lie to you. You can go look them up for yourself. There are people who have had reincarnation experiences. They'll tell you vivid memories of people that lived hundreds of years ago, and they can actually prove it, at least in some cases. And of course, my argument would be, and we have found that it's actually not that hard for you to implant memories in your brain. In fact, cults are actually using that a lot now. We found it's not very hard for you to do that. And the argument I would make is that it's not that hard for demons to implant memories in your brain, especially impressionable children, because it's usually very small children that have these experiences, like below the age of 6, before really the ego sets in and then this memories start to fade. Um, and also, when it comes to miracles proving other religions, Hinduism, back in 1995, there was a great milk miracle of 1995 where these statues, they were drinking milk all across India. It's a very impressive miracle. So yeah, you can prove other religions just through miracles alone. So what I realized is that Jesus claimed to be God, and that sets him apart from everybody else. He also claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life. So Jesus claimed to be the truth, and he claimed to be God. Well, I'm like, is there anything to back up these claims, or was Jesus just a deranged madman? Well, of course, there's the many accounts of the miracles that Jesus did, but more importantly, um, there is things continuing to back up what Jesus did. For instance, there's the resurrection. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, that sets him apart from everybody else. An Inspiring Philosophy, who is a Christian apologetics channel, did a wonderful series proving the resurrection of Jesus. Must recommend anyone who's watching this video. Highly recommend you go watch that video. It's a video series proving the resurrection of Jesus. Great series. And even a secular source like the Infographics Show actually did a really swell video. Okay, man, I said swell. I sound like I'm from Kansas, but did a really great video um, from a secular perspective, arguing that really there's no other explanation besides Jesus rose from the dead. So that there is a great evidence for Christianity, because that's very different from everybody else. Nobody else rose from the dead. But also, what I really realized, and for me is the greatest proof, is the sacraments. What makes Christianity unique, and I'm going to get to this a bit later in the video on some of the other spiritual stuff he's going to talk about, is incarnational theology. We believe that God became man, and that really is at the heart of our religion. Um, the Holy Eucharist, we believe in multiple sacraments, but the two big ones are baptism and communion. Baptism brings you into the church, and communion, it continues to feed you. All Christians believed until very recently, like Baptists and stuff have deviated, but historically all Christians have believed in the real presence, which we believe that somehow, some way, the bread and the wine are the body and blood of Christ. I know it's a bit weird. There are different debates on exactly how, but we've all believed it's the body and blood of Christ. And when I began to study, and I eventually experienced this myself, is that miracles of the Holy Eucharist are happening all the time. For instance, people will go to Mass or communion or whatever, and they get healed of different diseases, mental, physical. Many have profound experiences. I know in the Episcopal Church, they have a lot of open communion, and people who are not Christians will take communion and they will become Christians because of the profound experience they have when they receive the Eucharist. I myself have experienced the Eucharist. It's a very profound and deep experience. I've never experienced anything quite like it. But for me, one of the really compelling evidences is where it actually becomes the body and blood of Christ. You can look this up for yourself. I'm not making this up. It's real. They're called miracles, the Eucharist miracles. And essentially, what happens is that in Mass, when the priest is praying over the elements, the bread and the wine will become the body and blood of Christ. They will actually become blood, and they will actually become flesh. And this has happened for hundreds of years. And you can go look it up for yourself if you don't believe me. It actually becomes the body and blood of Christ. And the reason why the Eucharist matters so much is that it proves Christianity. If the Eucharist is real, that means that Jesus really is God incarnate. And that also means that he really did rise from the dead. Once again, nobody else rose from the dead. So those are really good arguments. Essentially, Jesus claimed to be God, and nobody else did, at least anybody major. There's a few crackpots, but Jesus claimed to be God. Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus also claimed to be the bread and the wine, and continues to be the bread and the wine. And there are many other arguments I could make for Jesus, but essentially, Jesus proves Christianity because essentially what I believe as a Christian is that Jesus Christ is the purest revelation of God the Father. And that's another unique thing about Christianity. We believe God to be a father. The heart of Christianity is believing that God is a father. I want to talk about that inside another video. But really, the argument that I'm making for this video and the perspective I'm taking in this video is that Jesus Christ is the purest revelation of God ever because he is God made flesh. And that's the view I'm taking. Therefore, I'm basing all my teachings on Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world, Lord and Master. So that's the perspective I take. I believe that Jesus Christ is the perfect mirror image of the Father, and that therefore all this spirit world stuff that's very hard and complicated to understand he didn't tell us everything. He told us what we need to know. And of course, he gave us the church and the Holy Spirit, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. But essentially, Christ is the mirror image of the Father, and therefore, on my perspective on the spirit world, we need to keep Christ at the center because he is the perfect revelation of God to man.
Which he never visited. Another is what turned into the Indic spirit world that he saw. There's a large population of ghosts who hover around the earth, incapable of coming to terms with dying. Monroe spoke to dozens of these ghosts, helping them onto their next place. This fits very closely with Buddha, who said some people go to hell, others heaven, some enlightenment, some reincarnation, and others stay around as ghosts. Buddha didn't believe other religions weren't valid. He just wanted to explain the way to his heaven, that being nirvana or enlightenment. The way I imagine this is as if the Europeans in the 1490s, before they discovered the New World, had different ways of going west to reach the Americas. The Spanish sailed west to the Caribbean, the Portuguese to Brazil, and the English to Newfoundland. The inconsistency of the reports might lead some people back in Europe to think that the Americas didn't exist at all. In reality, these different sailors were just using different routes to reach different areas. If the spirit world exists, why wouldn't it be truly massive with different kinds of geographic regions? The inconsistencies of world religions maybe aren't due to people making this up. Rather, through using separate spiritual methods, they were going to literally different continents in the spirit world. There are concentric spiritual rings around the earth of higher and higher abstraction. The further you astral project out into the spirit world, the more things change from the base reality you and I know. So, for example, if you visit your neighbor's house, it will be identical to our reality. However, once you go further back into history or into different planets, things start to be very different from our world. This fits exactly into what the pre-modern esoteric tradition believed, where planetary was synonymous with perfect. This is easiest to see in Dante's Inferno with the layers of hell. The pre-modern esoteric tradition believed in the 7 planetary gods, being Venus, Uranus, Saturn, Earth, and as you ventured further out into space, you saw different spiritual forces before reaching the ultimate, which was God. The reason the ancients thought heaven was in the sky was they conflated this spiritual, esoteric map of the cosmos with the actual physical world. The reason the CIA was researching this was to use this research in order to spy on the Russians more effectively. Classic US government. Rather than usher in a profound spiritual revolution, which could completely change the course of history, they were trying to use this to look at Soviet stuff. An ironic thing is that when the CIA released Project Gateway, they removed the page in which they talk about how these discoveries could be used to benefit society and world religions, which Monroe independently released without their consent. The scary thing is that astral projecting was pretty successful. A couple times they were able to get people to completely draw government installations they would have no knowledge of from blank. They could also mentally project movie images at people and often get them to say exactly the movie that they were showing. They could get people to read statistically significant numbers in rooms on the other side of the country. The problem, and probably why the government dismantled this project, and they might not have, and they're just keeping it secret, is that they could get occasionally incredible breakthroughs that were statistically impossible, but it wasn't consistently effective enough to warrant its continued use. They had hundreds or thousands of examples of finding information through this which would be physically impossible in any other way. Monroe would spy on his neighbors and later ask them at specific details that only they would know through astral projecting at that very time. He used it to occasionally unearth facts from dead souls from previous lives, and then he checked the historic data and saw it was correct. The reason the CIA was interested in this stuff was because they were able to use it enough to learn random things about the world. I've read books which have covered the statistical chances that you can randomly do stuff like this, and it's so low as to practically be impossible. One of the things which really shocked me in researching this video is that we've actually had a significant amount of research into psychics, and the research has basically proven that they exist. With exercises like guessing cards or gambling, people's passive psychic ability will increase the success rate a few percentage points ahead of what would statistically make sense. That sounds unimportant, but it's statistically incredibly significant and would not happen without humans having at least some latent psychic ability. That being said, What the research found is that most people are only very weakly psychic. However, there is a tiny part of the population which, due to genetic abilities, is vastly more powerful. This is something
I'm honestly open to this idea. For instance, when people die in NDEs and stuff, you usually telepathically communicate. And it wouldn't surprise me if people do have psychic abilities. I'm going to get into telepathy and stuff a bit later in the video. But one thing I would like to point out is that when it comes to all these grand wonders and stuff, we can't know something's of God just by how impressive it is. The demons have always been able to do very impressive things as well. They have great knowledge. Of course, God will only allow them to do what He allows them to do. Um, but we have to remember the only way we can truly know something is of God is by its fruit. And of course, does it contradict prior revelation? And we can only know by its fruit. So we have to be careful, is it bearing fruit? What really matters is it bearing good fruit. And that is of the life to the people. Is it bearing good fruits, fruits of the Spirit, as we read about in the Bible? And that's really the only way we can know, not by how impressive it is. But I am open to the idea of psychics and stuff. There's just so much I don't know. God is so much bigger than me. I'm open to the idea, and I'm going to talk about it a bit later in the video.
Something like 1% of the population whose psychic gifts are stunning. These are the people who are drawing secret government installations, foretelling the future, and probably those who are going the furthest into the spirit world. They were probably called wizards in previous eras of history. Keep in mind, every single society before in history, before ours, believed in magic, and we also never disproved magic as a society. Rather, we said it just didn't fit into our mental model. It wouldn't surprise me if in something like a million years we look back on the present and realize that we were in the process of evolving a new genetic ability, that being psychic abilities, in the same way that millions of years ago we evolved the ability to think rationally or to speak through language. And over the course of human history, we've been able to evolve to have new neurological abilities, so why should that stop now? There is some evidence that you can use the spirit world to figure out how the real world works. We saw this with the Hindus in the ancient world. One of my favorite books is The Eye of Shiva by Amory de Riancourt, which talks about how the Hindus reached conclusions about the universe in physics or psychology that we're only just discovering now. Also, the Hindus predicted an age called the Kali Yuga. The Kali Yuga is an age of feminine destruction in which the divine appears to be distant. Amory was an expert in Indian history and religion and wrote about how they had a scientific method of religion, how they had holy men who did all of these processes and over centuries compared their findings with each other to create a understanding and map of the spirit world. One of the points Monroe talks about is that the main communication method of the spirit world is NVM. This is
Okay, I'm going to talk about telepathy and stuff in a minute. And it's more than that. Like the Hindus, they understood physics and stuff very well. But the biggest reason for me why I'm not convinced of Hinduism, of course, I am convinced of the solid revelation of Jesus Christ. He's, the truest revelation of God. Is keep in mind that whole thing I said about fruits. Well, Hindu society has that brutal and oppressive caste system, where they oppress people based off caste and stuff, and they do things like that, and that's incredibly unchristian. Like Christianity has been used to do some pretty messed up stuff, but we've never sunk to that low, something of that caste system of that kind. And in a lot of these Eastern religions, like we often put them on a pedestal, but they're all about like the Hindu priest. He has nothing to do with the world. He always bathing himself. He wants nothing to do with the world. He reminds me of the Pharisees, and that's the same with the Buddhists. They want to get rid of the world. They want to just not be involved with the world. What makes Christianity so different is that incarnational theology. God became man, and now we are supposed to be the body of Christ in the world. We are to bear witness to the Father and to the Son. We are to evangelize the world, and ultimately we're supposed to see the merger of the material world and of the spirit world. The ultimate game plan of Christianity is there's going to be no more spirit world, no more material world. They're going to be one. And I'm going to talk about that a bit later in the video. But keep in mind that whole fruit. That's what makes Christianity so different, is that we don't deny, we're not getting out of the world, we're getting involved in the world. And that's why Christianity has invented science. That's why Christianity has done more charity work than any other religion combined. Christianity has done more good works than any other religion and faith in the world. And if you don't believe me, Why do you think it's Western nations, European nations, Christian nations, and particularly Western Christian nations, Protestant nations especially, and of course I'm a bloody Protestant, so of course I'm going to have that bias, is that we have done more to contribute to scientific development, to rights for people. We were the first society to outlaw slavery. I mean, Muslim society wouldn't have outlawed slavery without Christians forcing them to. Like Saudi Arabia didn't ban slavery till like 1960, for instance, and and okay, and Christianity has done more good works than any other religion in the world. So I just want to point that out. But he's going to talk about that a bit later in the video.
Communicating psychically through vibes. You know when you have a brilliant idea which just hits you and you immediately envision it? Imagine if you could share all the distraught and pain of when your parents died with a friend. That's NVM. What the other intelligent species Monroe talked to said is that this was their main form of communication. They said humans are strange for not evolving it naturally, as our ecosystem was less cloudy than normal planets. Thus, we evolved to communicate through sight and sound and not psychic abilities. They said humanity had cut itself off from most of the other dimensions and different worlds through not evolving psychic abilities, which are normal in other species. They said the reason we never found aliens is because we were on different wavelengths. Us sending out radio frequencies to discover aliens, they said, would be the equivalent of aliens trying to speak to us through car exhaust. Monroe and his crew consistently spoke to different intelligent spiritual forces. In the spirit world, you'll find some humans going between lives. Also, living humans have multiple layers of consciousness. You can speak to someone's subconscious even when they're awake and talking, and they won't know. Then there are non-human species, which Monroe saw as aliens, but are basically angels or demons. They're often happy to talk to Monroe and his crew and explain how the spirit world worked. Monroe built friendships with many of these beings, seeing them dozens of times repeatedly. The spirit world...
What I've come to realize is in Christianity, we're opening up ourselves to the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is coming in and He's influencing us and He's guiding us. But in spiritualism, the New Age, whatever you call it, all the revelations are coming from spirit interactions. In the most extreme examples, they will channel. Well, they will allow a spirit to come into them and allow them to talk through them, essentially turning you into a puppet. And this is the basis of spiritualism. Like, it's all about the New Age. It's all about interacting with spirits. You're supposed to go interact with spirits. And of course, I believe those spirits to be demons, deceiving people. The devil is the father of lies, for instance. And in this religion, they'll tell you that there is no objective truth, that everything is all wishy-washy, and it is demonic. It reminds me of what the devil said to Eve in the garden. Yea, is that yea what God said, but also, you will become gods. And that really is the New Age. You're supposed to believe that you are God, and then you come to the realization that you're God, and then you're supposed to work your way up to the ultimate high level of becoming a god. And of course, these spirits, these evil spirits, really is just a new lie, because the old religions, the old pagan religions, were worshiping evil spirits. That was the religion of that time. The gods we read about in the Bible are evil spirits, and people were worshiping them. And really, it's just an updated version where people are still worshiping these spirits. They're allowing them to infect them. They're allowing them to speak with them. And of course, I don't claim full knowledge of the spirit world. I am one man. But I've seen good evidence, and of course, I haven't even laid out my full case, that Jesus Christ is God in the flesh, and that therefore He is the purest revelation of God to man. And just be careful. That's what I'm really saying is don't just trust a spirit because it seems nice to you. Just be careful around spirits. I'm not anti-mystic. I'm not anti even interacting with angels and things. It's incredibly dangerous. Just be careful.
The world is largely chaotic, like a jungle or our real world. It's not orderly or safe like we like to imagine, but a natural ecosystem in which creatures have their own motivations, goals, they eat each other, some are stronger than others, and more. It's not a place of peace and serenity. That being said, there are very clearly some stronger and better types of creatures than others. Some of these things were benevolent and helped Monroe, and others were monsters who attacked him. The main way the spirit world operates is that it exists in opposition to our world. Our world is hard, difficult, brutal, and very real and tangible. It's often too hard and too real as we struggle every day to make ends meet. The spirit world doesn't have time. It's infinitely large, and thought creates action. The second you think something, it comes into existence. The thing is that this is incredibly boring, and the spirits envy the toughness of our lives. We have reality and thus have to test ourselves. Thus, the spirits are always struggling to have bodies to inhabit. Some try to demonically possess people, some act like parasites, and they're all happy to incarnate and enter human bodies. Although we may not feel like it, the spirits view our hard lives with jealousy. It's ironic that for much of human history, through religion, has been an attempt to escape to the spirit world. I think the spirit and material worlds exist.
As I said before, this is kind of not exactly. It is true that Christianity has always had the ascetic movement in a way to escape, but Christianity has also always been very involved with the world, fixing the world. I especially think of the Franciscan order, which really kind of struck a good balance between being spiritual and being in the world. And really, he's going to talk about the duality between the spirit world and the material world. And really, the beauty of Christianity is the two will become one. What we believe is in the new heavens and the new earth is that when creation is remade. And as a universalist, we believe that it's even deeper than this. Earlier in the video, he actually defends the doctrine of eternal damnation in kind of this new agey way, which is kind of like you're setting your brain links. But this is not hell or at all. What hell is the fire of God purifying us. That's what the Bible clearly preaches. And no, the Bible does not teach an eternal hell. The Greek word aeon just means age. It does not mean eternal. And the Greek word kolosene, which is the word they use for punishment, just means correction. I've made many videos on the topic, but sulfur fire is a symbol of purification in the Bible. What I'm getting to is essentially that we believe that eventually all people will be united to God through purification. And that's a big problem I've always had with this view of multiple heavens. Like I've heard multiple people say that there's multiple different afterlives, kind of taking this Buddha position. Like if you believe, however, that all people are children of God and that our goal is to ultimately we're all one big family, which universalist is a very big part of our faith. We believe that God is our Father and that we are all His children. We believe that we're all one family and that Jesus is going to lead us into the restoration and that all people will be made into one big family. It doesn't really make sense for there to be multiple different afterlives. It makes sense for all to be united, to all to be made new. And as Christians, we believe in the new heaven and the new earth. That day, that all will be remade. And he's getting ready to talk about this contrast between the spirit world and the material world. And I just thought it'd be very interesting to point out that actually there's going to be a beautiful union because we human beings, we are both physical beings. God gave us a body, and He's going to resurrect our body one day. But also, we are spiritual beings. We have a soul. It's very interesting to think about that we are both spiritual and material, and that we're continuing to follow in the life of Christ. And going back to, say, the Holy Eucharist or the sacrament of baptism, those are essentially the Spirit incarnate. I'm going to talk about how the Bible is the Word incarnate and how exactly that works. But it's just very interesting to think about this duality between the material world and the spiritual world that he's talking about, which I find very fascinating, and how they're going to be made one. I think that's just beautiful to think about.
Distant critical tension, and like a duality such as man and woman, war and peace, or day and night. The spirits explained life in the universe to Monroe and his crew. The interesting thing is that it basically perfectly mirrored what traditional religion says. They said that we should try to uplift our souls, that we should move past base materialism and survival, that spirituality would make us happy. Monroe saw heaven and spoke to God.
But that's about works. And of course, especially as Protestants, we believe in grace alone through faith alone. There's nothing you can do to achieve your own salvation. It's only by God's grace. And one thing I noticed about New Age religion is it's works-based religion. You're doing all these things to work your way into salvation. You've got to meet with Holy Spirit. You've got to meditate. You got to meditate, go into alternate states of consciousness. And I'm not against alternate states of consciousness. All religions come from visions and dreams and alternate states of consciousness and revelations from God. Even when we go back to the book of Genesis, God is speaking in visions, God is speaking in dreams. So I cannot deny that. But God does speak through different mystical means. But ultimately, we need to focus. The primary way we connect with God is the Word and the sacraments and prayer. Prayer is, we're speaking with God, and God is working in us, connecting with our intellect. The sacraments, God's grace is working through them. And the Word, God speaks through us through the Word. And He also gives us the means of grace through the Bible, which is the Word. And what I was pretty much saying is that New Age religion, it's very much a works-based salvation. I know that can be cringe for all those of us who grew up Baptist, but it brings up some very cringe memories in my head, that term works-based salvation. But it's very much true. In the New Age, you're working your way to salvation. You're working. It's all about, you've got to work your way to godhood. And though we do good works in Christianity, those are ultimately the fruit of faith. Faith, and this is the beauty of Christianity, God became man to save us. And only by God's grace and by faith in Him shall we be saved. It's very beautiful, and we will ultimately become like God through theosis, which is a complicated doctrine, or Christification, some call it, which is a complicated doctrine to understand, but we will become like God. Not God, but we will become like God. But that's all a conversation for another time. This is a broad tent video talking about a lot of different topics.
Well, the spirits gave assurance that God existed. The Monroe spirit world is not a Christian one, it being incredibly similar to Indian religions, but they do talk about different aspects and regions of the spirit world which match up with the Abrahamic. The spirits Monroe talked to are basically giving him notes, which perfectly match up with Stoicism and some Eastern religions. These spirits were literally writing essays through Monroe on teachings for mankind, while Monroe
And that's what I told you about interacting with spirits. That's called channeling. You can look it up yourself. The spirits will come into you and they will take you over. They will talk through you. They will write for you. And this is an incredibly dangerous practice. This is a form of demonic possession. Do not do this. Very dangerous. And these spirits are often lying. Do not do this. This is incredibly bad. Okay?
Himself had no experiences in those topics. Monroe's moral system is that you need to add to the learning in life, which is the universe. Evil things are those which drag us down towards base levels. For example, a war purely to justify your own greed is wrong, but a war to spread moral goods or advance technology is justifiable. The universe is learning through life itself. Thus, it's our duty to live life and experience it. Learning and having adventures for God. We really learn through emotions, and we need to teach our emotions to develop through life experiences. The human soul gets reincarnated again and again, and we all have an immortal soul which exists in infinity. This soul helps us out throughout our lives and is an accumulation of all of our reincarnations. It keeps reincarnating until it gets bored of this life, and then it reaches enlightenment. Death is an illusion which forces our souls to try harder in our individual lives so we can learn for God as best as possible. Love is the force which bonds the universe together, in that when we die, we bring the essence of everything we love with us into the afterlife. To finish, infinity is an incredibly important concept for Monroe's worldview. Outside of all of these dimensions is infinity. The universe is predicated upon the existence of infinity. Infinity is the timeless in which quantum physics atoms jump in and out of. Infinity is God. It is the place of peace which all mystics talk about, in which everything is
And I agree with the whole peace and mysticism and stuff. But it's very interesting how all these different religious figures, they talk about the great light, and this love and all that you feel, but really only Christianity has an explanation. And yes, this is a Christian apologetics video, at least at part. It's a weird mix of things. But what's very interesting about the Christian faith is, and especially as universalists, we've always held the idea that God is love very near and dear to our hearts. The Bible is the only book that says God is love. It was the book that coined the idea. But how is God love? How is God peace? How is God all these things? And what Christianity has is the doctrine of the Trinity. And this is a very fascinating idea. We actually see some proto-Trinity ideas in other faiths, but the idea is fully completed within Christianity. Because I do think there is truth in other religions. I'm a devout Christian, and I do think there's danger in other faiths, but I think ultimately there is some truth in them because at the very least God has put the law on man's hearts. But ultimately that truth is Jesus Christ because Jesus Christ said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So all truth ultimately is Christ. But the point I'm making is God is love. So we believe that love is a relationship. So we believe that the Father loves the Son, and then the Holy Spirit is a part of that as well. They love each other, and this deep and profound love, a deeply mystical union, the purest and most holy love. Out of this love, all the universe came. And this is the heart of the Christian faith, even more than the incarnation, the idea of the Trinity. And this is a very uniquely Christian idea. We do see some proto-Trinitarianism, some other faiths, because they do have bits of the light, bits of the idea. I very much kind of agree with the Roman Catholic Church on how we should view other religions. But there is light in other faiths. But ultimately, all this love and this peace they're talking about, that is experiencing the Holy Trinity, the deep and powerful love and relationship in the Holy Trinity. And that's very important to me because I actually used to be a Unitarian in my younger years, which means I didn't believe Jesus was God. And becoming a Trinitarian, it really changed my whole life. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Unified. The disunity of our world is predicated upon infinity. This is a concept all religions talk about, but is closest to the Indian. Infinity is true peace. Part 3. Before you get too excited. I know what I said here might get a lot of people really pumped. That being said, before we get too far, I do want to throw in some mitigating statements. The first being 2 stories from Monroe himself. Monroe saw that a more advanced species harvested our emotions and life experiences. Called louche in a farm, which they used to power their civilization. He saw the entirety of human existence being created and formed so as to be farmed by this society. The second story is that Monroe ran into a society that was on the edge of heaven, but was all based around committees, where their pastor kept them busy with church activities rather than just walking over through the gates of heaven. The reason I'm highlighting these 2 stories, I think they're symbolic of a very important point. These stories are great symbols of the issues of the society that Monroe lived in. The first one with louche is that industrial civilization is actually about harvesting our emotions for the wealth of others. Advertisers look at our life experiences and emotions and then commoditize them. The government and powerful subtly manipulate us in 100 different ways to manufacture consent. This is even more true today with the internet. When Monroe was looking at louche farming, he was seeing a representation of his own society shown through symbolic form. This is something the spirits actually told Monroe. They said what he saw was a representation of the truth, but a skewed perspective on it. The truth is a cone, and we all hug different parts of it. Let me give an example. To the Native Americans, the United States of America was a demon which ravenously destroyed their civilization and their environment for gain. For the Europeans in World War II, we were angels who saved them from the Nazis and then Soviet conquest. The thing is that we're looking at the same country. Both of these perspectives were valid in their own turn. The Hindus talked about a spiritual dark age called the Kali Yuga, of feminine chaos that would destroy civilization. Their dark age was the golden age of our civilization. This is an issue with the spirit world. As you stare into it, you're also staring at yourself. We reflect our own psyches into the spirit world. Dreaming is a great example of this, where we don't really have any good explanations for why we dream, except the spirit world. Monroe and Amaury say it's a daily reconnection to the shared unconscious which keeps us sane. That being said, we all know our dreams are representations of our psyche, which is something Freud and Jung wrote extensively about. In the same way where we don't take our dreams intensely seriously, where if I have a nightmare that a giant dinosaur is going to kill me, that does not inform my analysis that a giant dinosaur will kill me in my real life. And so I think that's a useful principle to apply here as well. We see this in world religions in which they all believe in the divine but have wildly different conclusions. Go back 2,000 years, and you have hundreds of local religions which taught different things of the spirit world, all created through authentic experiences.
Of course, the argument I would make is that many of those religions, if not all, are ultimately worshiping different demons and things that want to prey off humans and get them worshiping them as a god. And I do have mixed feelings about other faiths. For instance, if we go back, we know that, for instance, the Zoroastrians, the 3 wise men were Zoroastrians. They followed the prophet Zoroaster. We know that Zoroastrianism played did influence the Jewish faith. And we do know that the three wise men were Zoroastrians. So I do believe that God can work through other religions. And we also know that, for instance, Greek philosophy was incredibly influential in Christianity. We know that the this Apostle John had at least some knowledge of Greek philosophy. He did use it in the Gospel of John. Conversation for another day, but God does work through other belief systems. But as I was kind of saying, all this diversity, a lot of it is demonic in nature, and we did to keep that in mind. These are all little spirits and demons trying to mislead people and get them to worship them as a god, because they all want attention, they all want love, they all want our emotions. I think because there is bits of truth in this. Like, I will agree that some of this video, there's a lot of truth in it, but there's also lies, because that's how lying on a large scale work. You have to have some truth in the lie. But yeah, I do agree, and I do find it funny how they call him Luce, similar to the Latin Lucifer. Very funny to me, but it's just interesting to think about, interesting to ponder. I thought this was a very interesting video to ponder.
With the spirit world on the part of that society. I think the spirit world reflects back a level of complexity appropriate for the societies involved. The God of the Old Testament was so brutal since it was a society where the only motivator that would work would be brutality. That being said, when you're staring into the spirit world, it's not objective at all. What Monroe says is that things exist in the spirit world in a dimension we can't comprehend, so they translate them to physical forms comprehensible to us. If someone from the ancient world saw a spiritual tank, it would translate into a fiery chariot in their vision. The second dream of the town on the verge of heaven is symbolic for the church in the mid-20th century. Most Christians weren't religious in the way they were before, and didn't really believe in God. Thus, the church became about itself, effectively turning into a social club and not really believing in God. The church had rejected the insanity of
Okay, I'm going to talk about the Bible in a minute. But he's absolutely right. A wonderful example of this is the religion I was originally born into, and then my parents left for a better youth group. The religion of Methodism. When Methodism started, it was a very radical religion, and a religion very much in tune with the human heart. It was all about the human heart. And Methodism fell off in the 20th century. It became very liberal, and it really kind of left that behind. And a lot of religion left this mysticism behind. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the most successful forms of Christianity today are Orthodox Christianity and trad Catholicism and conservative Anglicanism, which are all very mystical, but also Pentecostalism. What both of these, really what Orthodoxy and Pentecostalism have in common is that they're rejecting the materialistically dead modern world, and they're very, very mystical. So yeah, that's just very interesting to point out how he is very much correct in how the church really in the 20th century left behind God and really became churchism, which is worshiping the church and not really worshiping God anymore. And it's just very interesting to think about. It's very sad to see too, and it is true now that the only sects that are really doing well are sects that are more extreme, that are more willing to differentiate from our society. And the old mainline churches are dying off, and they're continuing to try to just conform to society, and they're dying off. So yeah, it's just very interesting to think about. Now I'm going to talk about the Bible. Let him finish.
the God of the Bible, instead creating a tame white bread version. The second point I want to make is that
I think he's right and also wrong. How should we view the Bible and the God of the Old Testament? It's a high debate. Now, actually, some of that is the demonic. Okay, a channel called Enlighten. It used to be Enlightenment University. Did a much better video than I did called "Is God Evil?" He goes through the Old Testament and kind of points out how actually a lot of what we think is God in the Old Testament are actually demons and stuff. Very interesting, because essentially before Jesus Christ, God's messengers were angels. And some angels would do weird stuff because some angels were demons and they would do things. Because you have to keep in mind that in the Old Testament, they were seeing God through angels. Jesus Christ is the purest revelation of God because he is God in flesh. But in the Old Testament, they were seeing God through angels. And that's, of course, very different. Angels they're imperfect. They're like seeing God is the light, and it's like seeing them through a stained glass window. So you're not getting a perfect revelation. They also have demons and stuff. He makes a much better point than I do. It's called "Is God Evil?" It's on the Enlightened channel. Really good video, much better than I can make. But as for how to understand the Bible, Jesus is God incarnate. In the same way, the Bible is the Word incarnate. The Bible has both a human nature and a divine nature, in the same way that Jesus had both a human and a divine nature. The Bible is both fully a book of man and both fully a book of God, because it was God used men to write it. Um, but I'm not of that position that believes that the Bible is perfectly the Word of God. Every single position is inspired. And for me, I approach the Bible how Jesus approached the Bible. Jesus used the Bible to correct tradition. If you read the Bible, Jesus looked at the scriptures and he saw corrupt traditions forming in the synagogues, not the church. And he used the Bible as a source of correction. And he knew the Bible very well, and he frequently taught from it. However, Jesus also said there were errors in the Bible. When asked about the laws of divorce, he said that Moses made a compromise on the divorce law. And if we read the Bible, we do see signs of compromise in the law. For instance, in the book of Deuteronomy, which I do believe was written by Moses, when it talks about the Sabbath day, it talks about you need to take a day of rest because you were slaves in Egypt. But in a later book of Leviticus, we're seeing talking about that you need to take the day off because it's going back to Genesis. God took the seventh day off, so you need to take the seventh day off, and that's a sign of changing within the Bible. And even later in the Bible, God's like, I don't want animal sacrifices anymore. And just Jesus taught there were errors in the Bible, and not everything in the Bible is from God. And I don't think it's just one time that Moses compromised, nor do I believe it's just one time that men compromised on the scriptures. So the scriptures are very important. The way I would view it is that Jesus is the way we understand the scriptures. He's the purest revelation of God. And the scriptures are also a revelation of God. The Winchester Profession of 1803, which is like the bedrock of universalism, if you're like, it's like our great creed. I have it on my channel, my page, if you're curious. Says we believe the Bible contains a revelation of God. And I think that's the correct view. It's not the revelation, it contains a revelation. And really, in the Bible, we need to start with Jesus. If you're new to the Bible, read the four Gospels first. The book of Acts and the book of Romans are also really good sides to that, but read the Gospels first. Just read, I'd say, Matthew through Romans is probably a good start to the Bible. And we need to read the Bible through Jesus, because if it's not like Jesus, if it's not fitting in with the character of Jesus, because Jesus is the purest revelation of God, Jesus Christ is the purest revelation of God the Father. If it fits in with Jesus, we know it's of God. But if it doesn't, because there are some things in the law of the Old Testament and some things in the Old Testament, though I love the Old Testament, the book of Genesis is my favorite book of the Bible. There are some things in the Old Testament that just do not fit the character of God that we read about in Jesus Christ. So we do have to keep that in mind.
For a lot of this, we're dependent upon Monroe. Although he had hundreds of people independently go to the spirit world, the only one we have in-depth writing from is Monroe. Most of the theology here reflects the mind of one man. To be honest, that's true of basically all religions, but is still something to be aware of. There were similar experiments behind the Iron Curtain at the same time in Czechia, which used large amounts of LSD, which came to the same conclusions. They interviewed people off LSD and found basically the same exact stuff as what Monroe did with different details. The Russians have researched into this, which I can't find good results for. That being said, Putin's government publicly still says they use psychics and astral projectors even today, so I can imagine the results were successful. Thirdly, as a word of caution for the people who are discovering this, I know a lot of people who have used the Gateway Protocol unchaperoned. I've personally had some spiritual experiences when I wasn't ready for it, and it can be horrible. I know some people who were already not in a good headspace when they started doing this stuff, and it pushed them over the edge. Some other people where it put them through some weird personality.
I highly recommend the channel. He runs Enlightenment University. He's actually a Roman Catholic. I learned a lot about mysticism from him. It's Westcott Loudon is his actual name. He wrote a book called The Way of the Dream. He runs a great channel. It's now called Enlighten. He runs Enlightenment University. He's a Roman Catholic. Talks a lot about mysticism and stuff. If you're interested in this, highly recommend you go to him. Now, I don't fully agree with everything he teaches. Personally, if you're going to study mysticism from a Christian perspective, I would study monks and nuns and the great saints, especially the Orthodox Church and also Roman Catholics. The Roman Catholic and the Orthodox Church have great, solid monastic traditions, along with the Anglican Church. For me, they're really the three big historic branches of Christianity that are very historically rooted are the Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church, and the Anglican Church. Highly recommend. But just as I said before, every religion is its own map of the spirit world, and don't go in on this alone. Of course, I argue, of course, become a Christian and study the church and its traditions and study the scriptures, even though they're not perfect. The scriptures or the traditions are not perfect. But even Jesus did mysticism. He went out 40 days and 4 nights in the desert. If you do that without eating, you probably will have some hallucinations. Of course, I do believe Jesus actually did see the devil, unlike some liberal scholars. But that's enough of my little tangent. But seriously, don't just screw around with spiritualism. Go in slow and study and pray. Just be slow. There's no rush.
Personality transitions. This stuff isn't bubblegum, so be careful with it. We should develop institutions to deal with this sort of thing.
Okay, I'm sorry. I found that hilarious. It's just like you do realize that's what religions are. Okay, I'm not gonna diss on him too much, but I just found that ridiculous. It's like religions have been doing this, even like the drugs and stuff. Like different Indian religions, First Nations, they've been doing that for thousands of years actually. And different religions have been playing around with this stuff for a very long time. We don't need to build new institutions. We already have several major world religions that have already been pre-established. Of course, I believe Christianity is the real deal. Of course, I would say become a Christian, but at the very least, join a pre-existing religious tradition. All this stuff, how to deal with this stuff, has already been built up over the course of thousands of years. So please join a pre-existing religious tradition. Don't go in alone.
To make sure that it's done safely. I know my audience is young men, often of an intrepid and entrepreneurial mold, so you'll do this anyway, but at least your blood's not on my hands. If you do go on to these spiritual journeys, don't take everything you see as complete truth. There will be strange dreams which might haunt you, but are really symbolic of something in your subconscious rather than an external reality. If the aliens tell you you're in the Matrix and you need to start killing people to break out, you are just being paranoid, and it's not the perfect truth. Stay rooted to the earth. For a final brutal example, to look at a society which gave mystics of much of Monroe's vein total power, look to Indian civilization. There is much to admire in Indian civilization, as I said before in this video, but there also is an implicit criticism. India is a civilization run by the mystics and priest classes, and India is the least militarily, economically, technologically developed society of the big four Eurasian civilizations. And India had an oppressive caste system and was the society that treated women the worst. And if these mystic teachings were the keys to everything, India would be the most successful civilization, but the West, who studied the outside world empirically, was the one which dominated. Part 4. Why haven't I heard of this? For some frame of reference, all of human history believed in this extra dimension Monroe talks about. The only exception is the 20th century. Even in the 19th century, the occult was incredibly popular, in which people like Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, many presidents, and Karl Marx were obsessed with the occult. So, is it too crazy to believe that the 20th century found that this thing that every society believed in was actually true? The thing I find shocking is how little of a wave that this has caused. We literally have multiple government
I don't
agencies.
find it shocking at all. I've already talked about many miracles in the video. In fact, I think back to the Bible, and people saw the miracles of Jesus. I remember on the cross. I've thought before, like, you could send all the modern atheists back to the cross, and they would do the exact same thing they did to Jesus. They said, "You've saved others. Why can't you save yourself?" There were people who saw all these miracles that Jesus did, and they didn't believe. They said, "We want more. We want more." So this isn't surprising to me at all. That's the nature of man. But in the 20th century, in the 1960s, about the exact same time this happened, probably one of the greatest miracles ever happened. Our Lady of Zaytun. Pretty much what happened is back in 1924, a businessman bought a church, and the Virgin Mary appeared to him in a dream and said that if you preserve the church and dedicate it to me, because it's believed that the Holy Family actually visited that church in their time in Egypt, I will do a great miracle there. And then later in 1968, the Virgin Mary appeared, and she continued to appear for over 2 years, 1968 to 1970. Hundreds of thousands of people saw this from all around the world. It's Our Lady of Zaytun in Cairo, Egypt. big miracle photos, videos, you name it, it's there. The Egyptian government even looked 15 miles around for like projectors and stuff to make sure this wasn't a hoax. They've never been able to prove it wrong. But even atheists went there and saw it, and they were like, "Well, we can't be sure it's the Virgin Mary. Maybe we can't be sure." That's pretty much they're like, "Well, we don't know." Of course, there was already a dream, saying the Virgin Mary was going to do this. Even though I'm a Protestant, I do actually have, I do believe in the saints. I do believe in the intercession of the saints and stuff because there's just too much evidence to prove it. For instance, the Roman Catholic Church, they have about 10,000 saints, and to become a saint in the Roman Catholic Church, you had to perform two miracles, one in this life and one in the next. When when people ask you, and they don't believe in praying to the saints, they ask for the saints, like kind of like you ask your friend to pray for you, kind of the same deal. And pretty much what that means is there has to be at least 20,000, at least 10,000 miracles of intercession, and there's many, many more because especially the Virgin Mary and many Saint Peter and stuff, they've intercessed thousands of times. So I believe in the intercession of saints. There's just too much evidence to prove it. But what I was pretty much saying is that Our Lady of Zaytun happened at the exact same time, one of the most impressive miracles ever, and yet you don't hear of it. And there's other miracles of the Virgin Mary, though I'm not sure about them. Like, I'm not sure about Our Lady of Fatima, is it from God or not? But Our Lady of Fatima happened in 1917. Great, amazing miracle, miracle of the sun. And it didn't convert the world. But there's a lot of appearances of the Virgin Mary in the 20th century. Did not convert the world. I think of Lourdes. I'm not sure about Lourdes either, but I do think something's happening there. Like, there have been like 77 people undeniably proven that they were healed. And there's all sorts of different things. Miracles happen all the time. You just got to know where to look. I know in my own personal life, I knew somebody, and he said that like his aunt or whatever, like she just felt this weird urge one day to just like, that she's at a gas station and she just decided she's going to sit on her head like upside down. And then a dude came out and he had prayed to God saying that if I see a woman stand on her head, that I'll believe in you. And then that happened. And like stuff like that happens all the time. I remember being like 5 years old and I saw a news report that like a Bible had been caught on fire, a nursing home fire, and it was like in the middle of the bookshop, and everything in the nursing home had burned down, and all those books were ashes. But the Bible, though the cover was damaged, the Bible itself was intact, and that's not the only time that's happened. So miracles happen all the time. Just people are too blind and too caught up in their own sin. If they didn't believe Jesus Christ, I mean, the guards who, saw Jesus rise from the dead, they were bought off by the Pharisees. So it's like if the people who actually saw Jesus rise from the dead could be bought off by the Pharisees with enough money, I think just anybody could not believe no matter what they see. Pretty much the bottom line is people that are going to believe are going to believe, and people that don't want to believe aren't going to believe.
Agencies from the world's two most powerful countries saying that we discovered the spirit world. If this is real, it's an event of the importance of the discovery of the Americas, or one of the most important events in history. Meanwhile, almost no one has heard of this. The news never covers this publicly. I only heard about this since one of my friends watches the Y-Files, which made a video on this topic. None of my other friends, many of whom study spirituality professionally, had ever heard of it. I think there are two reasons why this didn't make much impact in our culture. The first is that by 2016, when this was released, our society had other issues. We've become so polarized that we didn't really care of anything new. It's crazy to think that we drowned out the news of this due to the Trump election and the years of insanity, including COVID, which have followed since. We are a very short-sighted and foolish society in general, so I'm not too surprised. I once asked my fan base what they would do if God spoke to them through a burning bush like he supposedly did with Moses. Most said they think that they were crazy or they'd ignore it as a hallucination. That's sad. A society that the divine can't reach is a doomed society.
Amen, brother.
We will possibly be known forevermore as those who dawdled on stupid distractions while ignoring that which is truly important, which lay right before us. The second reason, and a big part of why the government was hesitant to release this, is that our leadership doesn't want there to be a spirit world or God. If I was in charge of the government in the 60s, I would immediately declassify this, since I would want to help people by bringing them inner solace.
Oh, there was a huge spiritual revolution going on in the 60s. That's the time of the psychedelic revolution. That's the time when the mainline churches I talked about earlier began to die as the boomers left them. That's the beginnings. Well, about a few years later, it's the Jesus movement in the early 70s, which of course creates modern evangelical Christianity. A bunch of stuff is happening in the 60s. And Enlightenment University, the guy I talked about earlier, he made a very fascinating theory, which I think is correct, on why there wasn't this big spiritual revolution in the 60s, even though people were so into spiritualism and stuff. And that is um, self control. A fruit of the Spirit is self control. And essentially, what all the major religions will tell you is self control. They tell you need to fast, you need to control yourself sexually, you need to do those things for spiritual growth. But the New Age doesn't really preach that. They don't preach fasting, they don't preach sexual self control, they don't preach that kind of stuff. In fact, they even encourage sexual deviance of various degrees. Um, and pretty much the argument he made is that the reason there wasn't a big spiritual revolution in the 60s is that they didn't preach self control and self discipline. And he pointed out a really interesting dilemma in religion today where you have the mainstream churches that are preaching the self control, the self discipline, but aren't really preaching the mysticism, most evangelical churches. And then, of course, you have the New Agers, which are preaching the spirituality, but they aren't preaching the self discipline and the respect to authorities. So it's just a very interesting dilemma we find ourselves in spiritually today. And that's why I think Pentecostalism and Orthodoxy particularly are going to do exceptionally well in the future because they are doing the self-control and they're doing the mysticism, especially Orthodoxy. I think Orthodoxy, traditional Catholicism, and Anglicanism have very bright futures.
One of the points Charles Taylor talks about in his book, A Secular Age, which is about the decline in religion we've seen since the Middle Ages, is that one of our biggest reasons is that authorities, like in government and science, didn't want religion to be real, since if it was, they couldn't get power as easily. If there was a God, there'd be standards they'd have to be held against. The ruling class of our society rules through sciencism, or the external appearance of science. If you bring God back from the dead, it might make things complicated. This triggers a chain of mass social changes, which would probably destabilize those in charge. Keep in mind, those in charge largely don't want changes, given when you're at the top, the only way to go is down. In the 1960s, people were largely happy with modernity. It was the wealthiest era of history. Society was unified, peaceful, and metrics of happiness, social connections, and sex were the best in history. The post-war period in the West was the best period to be a normal person ever. At that point, questioning the assumptions of modernity looked like madness. You wanted to throw away a good thing? However, today we live in a failed society. Nothing works anymore. Under those conditions, you see people questioning the assumptions of a scientistic society since they know something's just not right. This is why Joe Rogan's constantly talking about the spirit world and psychedelics. It's why this research is coming out in physics, and possibly why Gateway was released at all. As life gets harder, we need the divine more and more. Much like the Bible and the classics of Greco-Roman civilization had been lying around for millennia, but the right confluence of variables resulted in them erupting into the Renaissance or Reformation. I very rarely end my videos on a positive note, but if things play out right, we might live to see something stunningly beautiful and wonderful in our lives. Imagine a spiritual revolution, various techniques, possibly machines and others, so that we as humans could interact with the spirit world and divine on a regular basis. Imagine that. Before we finish.
Okay, that's just an ad. Well, I found that very interesting. That's actually the heart of the New Age. They call it the Age of Aquarius. The New Age, that's why they call themselves the New Age. A new age is coming, and there's going to be this great spiritual awakening. And of course, I halfway believe it. I'm a post-millennialist, which pretty much I believe that towards the second coming of Christ, I believe the whole world's going to become Christian. I want to talk about this another day. And I believe that we're going to see massive changes. I think that the world, when it really does become Christian, it's going to be so radically different. I don't think we're going to live in our economic system. I'm not a communist, but I don't believe in capitalism. I think it's unbiblical. I'll talk about economics another day as well. I think we're going to see massive changes towards the second coming of Christ in our world. And the solution is not a new solution. He's talking about new ideas, new solutions. There is no new solution. The solution was established, well, from the foundations of the world. It was the Lamb slain. But 2,000 years ago, he came and he taught us everything we need to know. And he sent his spirit to guide us and continue to guide us. And if we just listen, we will get all the guiding we need to know. Um, I have massive respect for Whatifalthist, Rutherford Lynch. It says actual name. Huge respect. Great channel. Highly recommend check it out. Don't recommend everything. Don't believe everything he says. Of course, I don't believe it, but I do believe. I do think he makes really high quality videos. That was a really good video. Highly recommend. And I actually do believe we're going to see a massive spiritual awakening in our time. One thing Waterfall Tisk talked about is the 40s trend. Not in this video, but some of his older videos. He talked about that in America in the 1740s, the 1840s, and the 1940s. There were spiritual great awakenings. And I do hope that there will be a spiritual awakening in the 2040s. And I actually believe that if we do have a great religious revival in America, um, I think the Asbury Revival of 2023 was a good prerequisite to it. I do think it will actually come out of the West Coast, like California, Oregon, Washington. Why? Because that area of the country is very spiritual. It's also very beautiful. They're very spiritual in that area of the country, very new agey. They're very hungry spiritually in that part of the country. It's a very spiritually depraved part of the country. But it's not like New England where everybody's just atheist now. It's a very spiritual part of the country. And I believe God is working there. I was inspired by dreams people were having around the time of the Asbury Revival, where they were seeing a dream of the sun rising up over the West Coast, and that was going to symbolize there was going to be a religious revival. So I know I sound a bit crazy thinking that there's a good chance that one day California may be the next Bible Belt. I'm going to make a whole other video about that another time. But on that spiritual revolution, in 1985, a man named Howard Storm died, and he met Jesus. Amazing NDE. Highly recommend you look into it. But I decided he asked what would the future be like, and he was showed the world in 200 years, which for him would be 2185, or sometime around it at least. And I decided I'm going to play it. It's just a little 5-minute clip, and then the video will be over. And I'm just going to let you see what Howard Storm thought it was shown the future will be like, and I found it intensely interesting. And I think it's a good example of what that spiritual revolution we're going to see around the time. What he said is that they lived like Jesus and his apostles. And if you really think about the world in the book of Acts, the way they were living, the simple living, and the miracles and stuff, this really isn't that much of a lot. I've talked about in my video, Life in 200 Years. This really isn't that much of a stretch from the world we read about in the book of Acts and in the Garden of Eden. So just keep that in mind.
The world that they showed me in the near future, in a couple hundred years from now, is a world that is difficult for me to understand or accept. There was what I saw was no visible signs of technology. If there was technology, they hid it from me, or it was so subtle that I couldn't even see it. Maybe that's the case, but I assumed that, like, in the future, it would be a world of like high technology, and they showed me a world of not low technology, of no technology, where people's relationship with God, with the creation, and with one another was so intense that human beings controlled the weather of the planet. Not just for the welfare of human beings, but for the welfare of the entire planet. Everybody in the world was telepathically connected to everybody else in the whole world. People raised food by simply, meditating or thinking about the food, and the food would just grow, and then they would pick it and eat it. It was, not instantaneous, but just it happened before your eyes. Cabbage would grow from a seed to a full-blown cabbage in a matter of a few minutes. People lived in small communities. People could move from community to community freely if they wanted to. Most people didn't move around very much. Some communities put an emphasis on music. Some communities put an emphasis on science. Some communities put an emphasis on celebration, liturgy, worship. Some communities spent their time on physical relaxation and enjoyment, sports, and that sort of thing. Some communities were very contemplative and did
seemingly very little. Some communities were very active and sort of like were very much engaged with their environment, sort of what we would call gardeners, but they were literally environmental sculptors, making these very beautiful places with the vegetation and the geology around them. I mean, different communities had different emphasis, but they lived in total harmony with the flora and the fauna around them, in complete harmony with one another. And the main emphasis of every community was the individuals in the community, and most especially the children. When people had experienced what they felt was their full life experience, there would be a great celebration, and they would lay down, and they would die, and their souls, their spirits, whatever, would be raised up to heaven. Dying was not seen as a sad thing or grievous thing. It was a joyous time. It was celebrated as a birth. People ate simply, dressed simply. From what I was shown, there were no possessions other than the clothes on their back and a few simple instruments like musical instruments or tools or things like that, which were pretty much shared communally. It was a world that's very difficult for me to make any sense of, because it was like, there was great happiness. There was very little suffering. There was no disease, because people could, with laying on of hands, people could heal diseases immediately. The only real suffering that they showed me was sometimes people felt a sense of separateness, and the community would allow these people to feel that, but they would pray for that person. They would surround that person with love and bring that person back into the community. So it was possible for people to move a little bit away from the spirit of the community, but they were brought back into the community. No one was left. No one was ever lost for very long. But it was important sometimes for people to feel, to appreciate what they had. They needed to, lose a little bit of it once in a while. The Spirit of Christ lived in every heart, fully and completely. It's a world that is so completely unlike the world that we live in. That just how can we ever get there? But they assured me that this was the world that God envisioned for us, and it's not that far away.
Beautiful. Just beautiful. Well, I ain't got too much else to say. I've yacked on for an hour. I think you're tired of listening to me. But thank y'all for watching. God bless. I guess the other thing I would really add is, of course, be careful in your spiritual walk. I don't know everything. And another interesting fact is, for the religious future I think we're going to be living in, is that religious people tend to be the only people having children right now. Secular people have a very low fertility rate. Atheists essentially just have a negative fertility rate. So special groups like the Amish and stuff have incredibly high fertility rates. There's going to be like 10 million Amish, like 2,100 or something like that. So, looking forward to the future. The religious are going to outbreed the non-religious pretty much, and I think we're going to see massive religious revival in the future. I've heard it said that like spirituality and stuff are like where psychology was 100 years ago. I'm not sure exactly how I feel about that statement, but it's an interesting thought. Well, y'all have a good day. God bless. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and Christ will conquer.